Think about every dictator in history. Think about Stalin, who climbed through the ranks of a revolutionary party, survived purges, and died in his bed, surrounded by terrified subordinates. Think about Mao Zedong, who led a decades-long guerrilla war before seizing power and ruling China for over a quarter of a century. Think about Mussolini, who built a cult of personality on Roman nostalgia and held the title of Il Duce, the leader, for more than 20 years. Think about Francisco Franco, who ruled Spain from 1939 until his death in 1975, carefully managing rivals, building international relationships, and eventually dying peacefully as head of state. Think about Kim Il-sung, who established a dynasty in North Korea that continues to this day, more than 30 years after his death. Now think about Adolf Hitler. The more closely you study him, the more you begin to realize that he does not fit the pattern at all. In almost every way that a dictator can be defined, Hitler was the exact opposite. He came to power differently, he governed differently, he made war differently, he treated the people around him differently, and he ended differently in a way that no other dictator in modern history has replicated. This is not a video that celebrates Adolf Hitler or diminishes the monstrous scale of his crimes. The Holocaust, the deadliest act of deliberate genocide in the 20th century, was his creation and his obsession. But understanding precisely what made him different, what made him unlike every other tyrant in history, is essential to understanding how 6 million Jewish people could be murdered in the middle of Europe, how a modern industrial nation could be led to total annihilation, and how the world can ensure that such a catastrophe is never repeated. So what exactly made Hitler the opposite of every other dictator? In this video we will find out. So, without further ado, let us begin at the very beginning. Most dictators share a common origin story, and it is almost never the story of an outsider. Stalin trained as a revolutionary organizer and rose through the brutal hierarchy of the Bolshevik Party. Mao was a schoolteacher and self-educated intellectual who built his power base over decades of military and political struggle. Mussolini was a newspaper editor and committed socialist who pivoted to nationalism with calculated precision. Even the most seemingly improbable of 20th century dictators, men like Fidel Castro, Kim Il-sung and Saddam Hussein, had clear political or military training. They understood power structures from the inside. They had organizations behind them, they had networks, they had patrons. Adolf Hitler had none of these things. Born on April 20th, 1889, in the small Austrian border town of Braunau am Inn, Hitler grew up as the son of a minor customs official, Alois Hitler, whose illegitimate origins left young Adolf with a murky sense of family identity that he spent much of his early life suppressing. His father was strict and authoritarian, deeply committed to the idea of a stable civil service career for his son. Adolf, however, showed no interest in such things. He was consumed by art and dreamed of becoming a famous painter or architect. He drifted through his teenage years in Linz and Vienna with no professional training, no military experience, and no political organization. What he had instead was a vast and undisciplined appetite for reading, a powerful visual imagination, a gift for imitative drawing, and a brooding sense of his own special destiny. When he applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts in 1907 and again in 1908, he was rejected both times. The admissions committee found his draftsmanship technically adequate but lacking in imagination, and noted that his true talent seemed to lie not in figure drawing but in architecture. The problem was that architecture required a secondary school diploma that Hitler had never completed. His mother, Clara, died of breast cancer in December 1907, and that loss gutted him. She was the one person in his life to whom he was genuinely attached. Without her, and without a path forward in art, he descended into a period of drifting poverty in Vienna that lasted from 1908 to 1913. During which he sold watercolor postcards, slept in homeless shelters, and developed the virulent anti-Semitism and pan-German nationalism that would define the rest of his life. Compare this to how most dictators enter adulthood. They come from organized movements. They have mentors, patrons, comrades. They undergo hardship that tests and strengthens their political skills. Hitler underwent hardship that did nothing but calcify his hatreds and deepen his fantasies. He arrived in the political arena as a man with no organization, no experience, no connections, and no credentials of any kind except an extraordinary ability to speak. This brings us to the first great paradox of Hitler, and the first way in which he fundamentally differed from other dictators. He came to power not through a coup, not through revolution, not through military conquest, but through democratic elections and constitutional appointment. Almost no other modern dictator achieved power in this way. Mussolini did march on Rome in 1922, but his march was more theatrical threat than genuine military seizure. Stalin never faced a genuine public election in his life. Mao conquered China through a civil war. Most 20th century dictators seized power through force or through the threat of it. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg on January 30th, 1933, after his National Socialist German Workers' Party had become the largest single party in the Reichstag, receiving 37.4% of the vote at the height of its electoral success in July 1932. He was invited into power by conservative establishment figures who thought they could control him. Franz von Papen, one of those conservative puppeteers, famously told associates that they had hired Hitler, that within 2 months they would have pushed him into a corner so tight he would squeak. That miscalculation would cost Germany everything. But the point stands, Hitler did not seize power. He was handed it by men who thought democracy had failed and that a temporarily popular demagogue could be managed by sophisticated politicians. Every other major dictator of the 20th century took power through violence, or the credible threat of it. Hitler took it through the ballot box and a presidential signature. That is a difference of profound historical importance, because it means that every attempt to understand Hitler exclusively through the lens of tyrannical seizure misses what was most dangerous about him. He was not a warlord who conquered a state. He was a politician who convinced a democratic society to give him the keys. And he did it in the middle of a catastrophic economic depression when the unemployment rate in Germany had reached roughly 30% of the working population, and the middle classes had been wiped out first by hyperinflation in the early 1920s, and then by the Great Depression that began in 1929. The people who voted for Hitler were not monsters. Many of them were desperate, frightened, humiliated by Germany's defeat in the First World War, and convinced by a decade of skilled propaganda that the Weimar Republic was a foreign imposition, that the so-called November criminals had stabbed Germany in the back, and that only a strong national leadership could restore German greatness. Hitler told them what they wanted to hear. He told them the story they were already telling themselves, and he told it with an electrifying, almost hypnotic power that no microphone had ever amplified before, that no newsreel had ever projected before, that no political meeting in any democratic country had ever seen before. He was something genuinely new, a mass media demagogue in the age of radio and film, wielding modern communications technology with the instincts of an evangelist. Other dictators had propaganda. Hitler had performance. Once in power, however, Hitler diverged from virtually every other dictator in a way that becomes even more striking the closer you examine it. Most dictators, once they achieve power, become supremely rational about one thing: keeping it. Stalin was a brilliant and ruthless calculator who made alliances with the capitalist powers when it suited him, purged rivals with surgical precision timed to maximize his control, and made strategic retreats when necessary, including signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in 1939. A deal that would have been ideologically unthinkable if ideology had truly come first. Mao made dramatic ideological shifts, launching the 100 Flowers campaign to draw out critics and then crushing them, pivoting from the Great Leap Forward disaster to the Cultural Revolution, always with an eye on maintaining personal power. Franco, as Spanish nationalist forces prevailed in the Civil War, was a calculating pragmatist who kept Spain out of the Second World War, despite enormous pressure from Hitler, because he calculated that German victory was not assured and that Spanish neutrality served his long-term interests. Even Mussolini, for all his theatrical bluster, entered the war only in June 1940, when France was already collapsing and German victory seemed almost certain, having waited carefully to pick what he believed was the winning side. These men put self-preservation and political survival first. Their ideology was real, but it was always subordinate to the primary goal of remaining in power. Adolf Hitler was the opposite. For Hitler, ideology was not a tool of power. Power was a tool of ideology. and his ideology had a central obsession that no other dictator in history had ever made the cornerstone of a state: the systematic biological elimination of an entire people. To understand just how singular this was, consider the nature of most dictatorial atrocities. Stalin killed an estimated 20 million Soviet citizens through purges, collectivization famines, the Gulag system, and wartime executions. Those killings were primarily tools of political control, class elimination, and the forced modernization of the Soviet economy. Stalin did not hate his victims as a race. He targeted them as political categories: kulaks, Trotskyites, bourgeois nationalists, potential rivals. When a category was no longer useful, he stopped killing it. When circumstances changed, he reclassified enemies as allies. Mao's Great Leap Forward killed between 15 and 55 million people through famine and violence. But again, those deaths were the catastrophic byproduct of ideological economic policy, not the deliberate elimination of a biological group. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia murdered roughly 2 million people out of a population of 8 million in just 4 years between 1975 and 1979, targeting intellectuals, ethnic Vietnamese, Chinese, Cham Muslims, and perceived class enemies. But even Pol Pot's murderous regime had shifting political targets and pragmatic calculations at its core. Hitler had none of this pragmatism. From the first pages of Mein Kampf, written in prison in 1924, through the explicit orders he gave in the Second World War for the implementation of the final solution, Hitler's anti-Semitism was not a political tactic. It was a religious conviction. He genuinely believed, in a way that no serious historian doubts, that Jewish people were a biological threat to the German race, that they were behind international Bolshevism and international finance capitalism simultaneously, that they were responsible for Germany's defeat in the First World War, and that the future of humanity depended on their complete elimination from Europe. This belief did not waver when it conflicted with rational policy. It did not soften when it became militarily counterproductive, and it did not halt when Germany began losing the war. In fact, as we will see, it accelerated. This extraordinary ideological rigidity manifested in Hitler's relationship with the German military in a way that provides one of the most telling contrasts with other dictators. Most authoritarian rulers are careful to cultivate their military, whether through loyalty networks, promotion systems, financial rewards, or the selective use of ideology to bind officers to the regime. Stalin was ruthless toward his military, purging the Red Army Officer Corps in 1937 and 1938 in a wave of executions and imprisonments that crippled Soviet military readiness. But even he eventually learned from his catastrophic errors and gave capable commanders like Georgy Zhukov the latitude to do their jobs when Germany invaded in 1941. Mao built his entire revolution on the military and gave the People's Liberation Army a central role in Chinese political life for decades. Franco was a general himself and remained deeply embedded in the military hierarchy throughout his dictatorship. Hitler, by contrast, began his relationship with the German military as a total outsider, a mere corporal with a decoration for bravery but no officer training and no staff experience, and he ended that relationship having systematically destroyed the professional independence of every general who served him. The story of how Hitler dismantled the German military's capacity for independent thought is one of the most dramatic and consequential stories in the history of the Second World War, and it is told most vividly through the fates of the men who carried out his orders. Take Walter von Brauchitsch, born into a military family who followed in the footsteps of his forefathers, building a career in the German army that saw him rise to the rank of Commander-in-Chief of the German army from 1938 to 1941. Brauchitz's military career was marked by strategic expertise, especially during the successful Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940. He oversaw key operations in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Every competent military analyst understood that the speed of those early campaigns was the result of outstanding professional planning and operational execution by the German Army's officer corps. But despite his early success, Brauchitz's tenure as commander-in-chief was impaired by his inability to control Adolf Hitler's increasing interference in military matters. Hitler's micromanagement undermined Brauchitz's authority, especially during critical campaigns such as the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, which ultimately led to disaster for Germany on the Eastern Front. His health deteriorated, culminating in a heart attack in November 1941. This health crisis, coupled with the failure of Operation Typhoon, the ambitious attack on Moscow that stalled in the mud and frost before the Soviet capital, led to his dismissal by Hitler in December 1941. From that point on, Brauchitsch spent the remainder of the war in forced retirement at his estate, effectively sidelined from further military involvement. The end of the war brought a dramatic shift in his circumstances. In August 1945, British forces arrested him on charges of war crimes. He was held in custody for 3 years, awaiting trial for his actions during the war. However, fate had other plans for the former field marshal. On October 18, 1948, just as he was set to face prosecution, Walter von Brauchitsch died of pneumonia. His death before trial raised questions about justice and accountability for high-ranking military leaders after the war. The man who had once commanded Hitler's armies would never have to answer for his actions in a court of law. No other major dictator in modern history fired his senior military commanders with anywhere near the frequency or recklessness that Hitler did. Compare this to how other dictators treated their military chiefs. Stalin, even after the purges of 1937, kept Zhukov and the capable survivors in place for the duration of the war when he realized he needed professional military judgment. Churchill feuded with his generals, but never fired them for disagreeing with him about military strategy in the way Hitler did. The American command structure under Eisenhower was famously collegial, with disagreements resolved through deliberation rather than dismissal. Hitler, by contrast, operated on the principle that any general who proposed retreat or questioned his strategic instincts was either a coward or a traitor. He fired Walter von Brauchitsch. He fired Gerd von Rundstedt 3 times. He fired Georg von Küchler, Fedor von Bock, Ewald von Kleist, and Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb. He fired Erich von Manstein, probably the most talented operational commander the Wehrmacht possessed, in March 1944. He took personal command of Army Group South from Brauchitzsch's successor in December 1941, and never relinquished it, while simultaneously serving as Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces and Head of State. No other modern dictator attempted to personally command an army group in the field, while also running a government and a totalitarian party apparatus. It was a recipe for catastrophic decision-making, and catastrophic decision-making is exactly what it produced. Consider the case of Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, a career military officer who began his service in the Bavarian army and rose through the ranks during World War I, where he distinguished himself as a capable officer, earning several medals, including the prestigious Military Order of Max Joseph, which granted him a noble title. Leeb commanded Army Group C during the invasion of France in 1940, playing a key role in the rapid defeat of French forces, a success that earned him a promotion to Field Marshal. On March 30th, 1941, Leeb was among over 200 senior military officers who attended a speech delivered by Adolf Hitler, in which Hitler detailed his vision for an ideological war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. This speech was the moment when professional soldiers were told in explicit terms that the coming war in the East would not be fought according to the conventions of international law or the military traditions of the German officer corps. It would be a war of racial extermination. Leeb's forces during Operation Barbarossa were implicated in war crimes against civilians, cooperating closely with SS Einsatzgruppen responsible for mass executions, particularly targeting the Jewish population. Leeb was also involved in transmitting the Barbarossa Decree, which authorized the killing of Soviet political commissars and the harsh treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. On January 15, 1942, Leeb requested that Hitler either grant him autonomy in his command or relieve him of his duties. Hitler chose to relieve him, and he was never given another command for the rest of the war. After the war, Leeb was tried in the High Command trial. Despite serious allegations, the trial resulted in a surprisingly lenient sentence. His defense attorney portrayed him as a humane soldier who had not seen or transmitted criminal orders, arguing that the actions of his troops were the result of battle conditions and military necessity. The court convicted Leeb of transmitting the Barbarossa Decree and its criminal application by subordinate units. However, he received only a 3-year imprisonment sentence, which was effectively time served. Leeb's case exemplifies the complexities of post-war trials, where some high-ranking officers received minimal punishment. It is worth noting that despite his light sentence, Leeb had received substantial financial benefits from the Nazi regime. including secret gifts of 250,000 Reichsmarks and an estate valued at 660,000 Reichsmarks, indicating a level of complicity and reward for his loyalty. After his release, he went back to his estate in Hohenschwangau, Bavaria, and passed away following a heart attack in 1956. The figure of Georg von Küchler illustrates the same pattern from a different angle. Küchler's military career began in 1900, and he gained considerable experience during World War I and the interwar years, where he specialized in artillery. His career reached its peak during World War II, when he commanded the 18th Army and later Army Group North, playing a significant role in the invasion of the Soviet Union. He was promoted to Field Marshal in 1942. By early 1944, with the Red Army making significant advances and Soviet forces relentlessly pushing westward, Küchler was relieved of his command by Adolf Hitler due to his failure to halt the Soviet counteroffensives. His argument that strategic withdrawal was operationally necessary was precisely the kind of professional military judgment that Hitler could not tolerate. At the end of the war, Küchler was arrested by the American army. Unlike some of his counterparts, Küchler faced genuine consequences. In the High Command trial, he stood accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Soviet Union. The trial revealed the extent of his involvement in atrocities, including the murder of mentally disabled individuals in occupied territories. During the proceedings, Küchler admitted to the harsh conditions in prisoner of war camps but attributed them primarily to winter conditions, which he described as an act of God. He also claimed that the army exaggerated prisoner of war mortality rates to receive more supplies. Despite these attempts to mitigate his responsibility, the court found him guilty. Küchler's conviction resulted in a 20-year prison sentence, though his sentence was reviewed and reduced to 12 years in 1951. In February 1953, he was released from prison, having served less than a decade for his crimes. He went on to live with his wife in the Garmisch region and passed away in Garmisch-Partenkirchen on May 25, 1968. What do these stories of fired, tried, and imprisoned generals tell us about the difference between Hitler and other dictators? They tell us that Hitler demanded from his military commanders something that no other modern dictator demanded. Not just obedience, but ideological agreement. Stalin executed generals, but he executed them for political disloyalty, for alleged Trotskyism, for suspected contact with foreign intelligence services. He did not, in general, execute generals for proposing operational retreats. When circumstances forced it, he allowed his commanders tactical flexibility. Hitler did not. For Hitler, a proposed retreat was a moral failure. It was cowardice. It was defeatism. It was evidence of ideological contamination. The generals who served him were therefore caught in an impossible bind: follow orders that they knew were militarily catastrophic, or face dismissal, arrest, or worse. This is why, when German generals interrogated by Allied intelligence after the war were asked what they thought of their Allied counterparts, many of them gave fascinating answers that reveal more about Hitler's system than they perhaps intended. General Alfred Jodl, who served as the Chief of Operations Staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht throughout the war, once said about American General George Patton, "He was the American Guderian. He was very bold and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes." That comment is striking for many reasons, but the most important is its subtext. Jodl was describing exactly the kind of general that Hitler had destroyed in the Wehrmacht: bold, initiative-taking, large-scale maneuvering commanders who were willing to take calculated risks against conventional military wisdom. The Germans had such commanders at the start of the war. Heinz Guderian, who was the mastermind behind Germany's Blitzkrieg strategy, could not help but admire Patton's tactical prowess. Guderian said of him, "I hear much about General Patton, and he conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." General Gunther Blumentritt, who was a key planner of the invasions of France and Poland, described Patton as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, noting that his operations impressed the Germans enormously, probably because he came closest to their own concept of the classical military commander. What the German generals were acknowledging in their grudging tributes to Patton was that the Allies had what they increasingly lacked: generals with genuine freedom of operational initiative. because Hitler had spent 5 years systematically destroying that freedom in his own army. The consequences of this micromanagement became catastrophic on the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Paul Ludwig von Kleist, whose career spanned both world wars and who was particularly recognized for his leadership during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns, commanded the 1st Panzer Group during the invasion of France in 1940, leading a fast-moving armoured thrust that penetrated deep into French defences. In 1941, commanding the 1st Panzer Army during Operation Barbarossa, he led some of the largest tank battles in history, including the encirclement of Soviet forces at Uman and Kiev, operations that inflicted massive losses on the Red Army and contributed to the initial German advance into Soviet territory. But even Kleist's campaigns in the Soviet Union eventually revealed the limits of a strategy that Hitler was simultaneously demanding, directing, and undermining. In 1942, Kleist was appointed commander of Army Group A during the German offensive into the Caucasus, tasked with capturing the vital oil fields of the region. The campaign faltered due to the overextension of German resources and fierce Soviet resistance. By early 1943, the Germans were forced to retreat from the Caucasus, marking a turning point in the war. On March 30th, 1944, after a series of retreats and failures, Kleist was dismissed by Hitler, who increasingly distrusted his military commanders. Following the unsuccessful attempt to assassinate Hitler on July 20th, 1944, the Gestapo even implicated and arrested Kleist because of his cousin's involvement in the Oster conspiracy. Despite the arrest, Kleist managed to avoid trial and was subsequently released. After the war, he was captured by Allied forces and handed over to Yugoslavia, where he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for war crimes. He was later extradited to the Soviet Union, where he faced trial for war crimes related to his commands on the Eastern Front. Kleist was sentenced to 25 years in a correctional labor camp. His final years were spent in Soviet captivity. On November 13, 1954, he died of heart failure while imprisoned at Vladimir Central Prison. His death made him one of the highest-ranking German officers to die in Soviet custody. The contrast between Hitler's treatment of his military advisors and the approach taken by other wartime leaders could not be more stark. Winston Churchill famously drove his generals to distraction with his constant interventions, his harebrained schemes, his refusal to accept military assessments that conflicted with his instincts. But Churchill had one quality that Hitler completely lacked: the ability to eventually defer to professional judgment when the evidence was overwhelming. When Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, persistently blocked Churchill's more dangerous ideas, Churchill raged against him privately, but accepted the professional judgment. When the American and British commanders united to tell him that a cross-channel invasion required specific preparation that could not be rushed, Churchill accepted that verdict even though it frustrated him deeply. Hitler accepted nothing that contradicted his instincts. He had no equivalent of Alan Brooke, no figure with the standing and the trust to say no and be heard. The men around him had learned, through the dismissals and humiliations and occasional executions of those who tried, that disagreement was not an option. This created a military machine that was increasingly capable of magnificent operational execution at the lower and middle levels, where officers retained some freedom, but was strategically paralyzed at the top, where every major decision flowed through a single, increasingly disconnected mind. And here is the truly horrifying thing: that single mind for the first 2 years of the war was spectacularly right. The fall of France in 1940, which astonished even the German generals who carried it out, was largely the result of Hitler's insistence on adopting Manstein's Ardennes plan against the recommendation of most of the traditional high command. The decision to invade Yugoslavia in April 1941 was Hitler's impulsive personal choice, and it worked so rapidly that it barely disrupted the preparations for Operation Barbarossa. Even some aspects of the early Soviet campaign went better than professional military planning would have predicted. And those early successes were catastrophically dangerous because they convinced Hitler that his intuition was superior to his generals' training. A man who was right occasionally about military matters but right for the wrong reasons is more dangerous than a man who is consistently wrong, because the occasional success reinforces his conviction that he is a military genius while the pattern of his errors remains invisible to him. By the time the catastrophic consequences of his strategic choices became impossible to deny, he had so thoroughly dismantled the system that could have corrected him that correction was no longer possible. This brings us to one of the most remarkable differences between Hitler and every other major dictator in history, and it concerns the question of succession and dynasty. Look at virtually any authoritarian ruler in history and you will find some version of a succession plan. Stalin cultivated a circle of loyal subordinates, any of whom might eventually succeed him. Mao designated successors, even if he ultimately destroyed most of them. Kim Il-sung built a dynasty that placed his son Kim Jong-il in power and eventually his grandson Kim Jong-un, making North Korea the only hereditary communist state in history. Mussolini never formally designated a successor, but the institutional machinery of Italian fascism could in theory have continued without him. Even the Roman emperors, brutal and capricious as many of them were, went to considerable lengths to adopt or designate successors who could continue the imperial system. Adolf Hitler left behind nothing. He had no biological children. He had no designated heir who held genuine power. He had spent the last years of his life systematically humiliating and destroying the reputations of every potential successor, whether political figures like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, or military figures like the generals we have just discussed. When he died on April 30th, 1945, in the bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, he left behind a shattered country, a discredited ideology, a dissolved state, and a carefully composed will that appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, a choice so surprising that many of those who received the news initially refused to believe it. Why Dönitz? Probably because he was one of the few senior figures who had never been associated with any of the coups, conspiracies, or negotiations that Hitler had come to view as treachery. Dönitz was reliable. But reliability was not the same as succession capacity, and the Flensburg government that Dönitz attempted to form in the final days of May 1945 lasted exactly 23 days before the Allies dissolved it. No other dictator's system collapsed so completely and so immediately upon his death. Stalin's Soviet Union continued for nearly 40 years after his death. Mao's China continues to this day. Mussolini's Italy transitioned awkwardly to democracy and then to a restored monarchy before surrendering. Franco's Spain began a successful transition to democracy within 3 years of his death in 1975. Only Hitler's Germany simply ceased to exist, replaced entirely by an Allied military occupation that explicitly rejected any continuity with the Nazi state. That is an extraordinary outcome. It tells you something crucial about the nature of Hitler's dictatorship. It was entirely and personally him. It was not a system that could survive him. It was not a movement that could regenerate. It was the projection of one man's will onto an entire nation. And when that man's will was extinguished, nothing remained. Karl Dönitz, who had commanded the U-boat fleet of the Kriegsmarine with ferocious dedication from 1939 until the Allied anti-submarine campaign turned the tide against Germany in May 1943, found himself in the bizarre position of being Hitler's chosen successor as head of state. Dönitz was a pivotal figure in naval history during World War II. He had ignited a fierce battle in the depths of the Atlantic, and as he rose to the rank of Grand Admiral, succeeding Erich Raeder, he posed a formidable threat to Allied naval forces. From 1939 to 1943, his U-boats had dominated the Atlantic, but the tides shifted come May 1943, testing the resilience of his fleet. After Hitler's demise, Dönitz succeeded him as head of state, directed the signing of Germany's surrender, and served as the nominal president of Germany and supreme commander of the armed forces until the Allied powers dissolved his cabinet. Dönitz's controversial affiliation with the Nazi Party and his unwavering support for Hitler cast a long shadow over his legacy. Tried as a primary war criminal at the Nuremberg trials, he faced charges of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. While acquitted of crimes against humanity, he was found guilty of the other charges and served a 10-year sentence in Berlin's Spandau prison. After his release in 1956, Dönitz relocated to a small town near Hamburg. In 1958, he published his autobiography, Memoirs 10 Years and 20 Days, passionately claiming that he had no knowledge of Hitler's crimes. He passed away in 1980 after a prolonged illness. Dönitz's brief and inglorious succession stands as a final proof of how completely Hitler had hollowed out every structure around him. His successor was not a politician with a power base, not a military figure with an independent constituency, not an ideological heir who could continue the movement. His successor was a naval officer chosen precisely because he had never been important enough to be dangerous. That is the opposite of what every other dictator in history arranged for himself. Now let us turn to something even more revealing. The question of how Hitler treated the people who were closest to him, the inner circle of the Nazi state. Other dictators, whatever their crimes, generally showed some capacity for personal loyalty, some recognition that binding key subordinates with genuine rewards and genuine trust was essential to maintaining a functional power structure. Stalin cultivated his inner circle with an almost perverse intimacy, dining late into the night with men like Molotov, Beria, and Khrushchev, binding them together with shared guilt and shared terror. Mao maintained a court that, for all its dangers, offered its members extraordinary privileges and genuine influence over policy. Even the most isolated of modern dictators maintained trusted lieutenants who could operate with some degree of autonomy within defined spheres. Hitler did the opposite. He deliberately cultivated chaos, rivalry, and institutional confusion among his subordinates because he believed, correctly, that men who were competing with each other for his personal favour would never unite to oppose him. The result was a government of extraordinary dysfunction in which multiple overlapping agencies competed for authority, clear chains of command barely existed, and almost nothing could be decided without Hitler's direct intervention. And because Hitler famously worked erratic hours, sleeping late and staying up until dawn to watch films or monologue to exhausted aides, this meant that decisions regularly backed up for days or weeks. A modern industrial war economy cannot function this way. But Hitler did not run Germany as a modern industrial war economy. He ran it as a personal court, where everything revolved around the mood and whims of a single individual who was simultaneously brilliant, erratic, visionary, petty, strategically audacious, and tactically catastrophic. Look at the inner circle and what happened to its members when the Third Reich finally collapsed. Look at Hermann Göring, whose daughter Edda had been born just before the eruption of World War II. Her early years spent mainly with her mother at the Hall, the Göring family estate. Edda's early life was defined by the luxury and privilege that came with her father's powerful position. She was often photographed at public events, a symbol of the Nazi regime's attempt to project an image of wholesome family life. She was the recipient of numerous historic art pieces during her childhood, including a Lucas Cranach The Elder Madonna and child painting. As the war neared its end, she and her mother relocated to their mountain residence at Obersalzberg, close to Berchtesgaden. The end of the Second World War brought a reversal of fortune for the Göring family. Hermann Göring was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials for war crimes. Although he escaped the gallows by committing suicide with a cyanide capsule on the eve of his execution, his actions left Edda with a tainted legacy that she spent the rest of her life trying to reconcile. Edda Göring attempted to live a life away from the public eye. She rarely spoke about her father in public, but maintained that he was a good man in private conversations. In the decades of the 1950s and 1960s, many of the valuable gifts she had received in her youth, including the Madonna and child artwork, became embroiled in long legal disputes, most of which she lost in 1968. She passed away in 2018, leaving behind a life forever marked by the actions of her notorious father. What does the story of Edda Göring tell us? It tells us that the children of Hitler's inner circle were collateral damage, caught in the wreckage of a system that their parents had built and served. But there is something deeper here that goes to the heart of why Hitler was unlike any other dictator. For most authoritarian rulers, personal loyalty to the inner circle extended, at least partially, to their families. Stalin's associates watched their children carefully, but those children were not automatically condemned. Under Hitler, the contamination ran so deep and the collapse so complete that virtually no member of the senior Nazi hierarchy escaped the stigma of their father's crimes. The children of the Nazi leadership grew up, in most cases, forced to reckon with histories that no child should inherit. Consider the story of Martin Bormann Jr., the eldest son of Nazi Party official Martin Bormann, whose own fate remained mysterious for decades after the war. Martin Bormann Jr. was born on April 14, 1930, and was only a child during the height of his father's power and the atrocities of World War II. Growing up under the shadow of his father's prominent position in Hitler's inner circle, young Bormann's childhood was far from ordinary. He was kept sheltered from the gruesome reality of the Nazi regime, and after the war he was confronted with the horrific actions attributed to his father, a realization that led him on a journey of remorse and redemption. Distancing himself from his father's ideology, Bormann Jr. converted to Catholicism and devoted his life to the church. He even worked in the mission fields of Congo and Cameroon, striving to make amends for his father's misdeeds. However, in 2011, Bormann found himself at the center of abuse allegations from a past student, who claimed that Bormann had abused him when he was 12 years old in the early 1960s. There were further accusations of severe physical violence against other students. At the time these allegations surfaced, Bormann was battling dementia, rendering him unable to address the accusations. While these allegations never led to any legal action, the independent Klasnik Commission, set up to probe abuses within the Catholic Church in Austria, awarded the accuser compensation. The irony of Martin Bormann Jr.'s trajectory from the son of one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich to a missionary priest seeking redemption in Africa is almost unbearable. No other dictator's inner circle produced such extremes of inherited guilt and tortured self-reinvention. Gudrun Himmler, born on the 8th of August 1929 and the only child of Heinrich Himmler, took a radically different path. Despite the notorious history associated with her father, who was one of the key architects of the Holocaust and the man who built and commanded the SS apparatus responsible for murdering millions, she remained a staunch supporter of him until her death in 2018. Heinrich Himmler had a special fondness for his daughter, ensuring she was flown to his Berlin offices from her residence in Munich, where she lived with her mother. He maintained close contact with her, making daily phone calls when she was at home and sending weekly letters. He affectionately referred to her by her childhood nickname, Pupi. She also joined him during certain official functions, which in retrospect meant that a young girl was being presented as a wholesome symbol of Nazi family virtue at events organized by the man running the concentration camp system. She contested the widely accepted belief that her father committed suicide by biting into a hidden cyanide capsule. Instead, she insisted he was assassinated. Following World War II, both she and her mother were apprehended by American forces and detained in a series of camps situated in Italy, France, and Germany. They were summoned to Nuremberg to provide testimony at the trials and subsequently released in November 1946. Throughout her life, Gudrun worked diligently to preserve her father's image and memory. She became an integral part of the Stille Hilfe, or Silent Aid, a secretive organization providing support to arrested, condemned, or fugitive former SS members. Her involvement with the organization was a testament to her unwavering loyalty towards her father's legacy. Here was a woman who spent 8 decades refusing to acknowledge what her father had done. She died in 2018, still defending Heinrich Himmler. What kind of system produces that? What kind of father-daughter relationship could survive the knowledge of the Holocaust intact? The answer, tragically, is one in which the child was so thoroughly indoctrinated into the ideology that the crimes were not crimes at all, but acts of historical necessity. That is the legacy of Hitler's state. It did not just kill millions of people. It contaminated the souls of those who served it so completely that even their children could not see clearly. Niklas Frank, son of the infamous Nazi war criminal Hans Frank, took the opposite path and represents perhaps the most searing example of how the children of Hitler's hierarchy processed their inheritance. Born in 1939, Frank was too young to comprehend the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. Hans Frank was known as the Butcher of Poland, serving as Hitler's personal lawyer and later as Governor-General of occupied Poland, where he presided over the systematic murder of millions of Polish civilians and Jews. After the war, Niklas Frank confronted the horrific actions attributed to his father in the most public and unsparing way imaginable. He has written several books, including In the Shadow of the Reich, which details his efforts to comprehend his father's deeds and their impact on his own life. Frank's commitment to educating others about the Holocaust and its lasting effects on families of perpetrators and victims alike is remarkable. His candid public discussions add a unique perspective to Holocaust remembrance and serve as a potent reminder of the atrocities that can result from unchecked hatred and bigotry. Nicholas Frank's public denunciations of his father stand in stark contrast to Gudrun Himmler's lifelong defense of hers, and together the two lives illustrate the impossible moral landscape that Hitler's regime created for those unfortunate enough to bear the names of its architects. Rolf Mengele, son of the infamous Nazi doctor Josef Mengele, who conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, was born on March 16, 1944, and raised away from the concentration camps where his father carried out his notorious work. Rolf's early life was largely shrouded in mystery and misinformation. He was led to believe his father had been a war hero and only learned the chilling truth as a young teenager. Despite the burden of his name, Rolf made efforts to lead a normal life, studying law and working as a corporate lawyer. After the war, Josef Mengele fled to South America. Relocating to a new continent meant that Mengele had to leave his son Rolf behind. This absence made Rolf a person of interest, particularly for Nazi hunters who believed he kept in contact with his father. To some extent, they were correct. Mengele did write several letters to his son, sparking Rolf's curiosity and leading him to make a journey to South America in 1977 to meet his father. Reflecting on his journey, Rolf acknowledged that his father displayed no guilt for his horrific deeds in Auschwitz, even attempting to rationalize them. Despite despising his father and everything he represented, Rolf could not muster the strength to betray him. He kept silent about Mengele's South American hideout, and the notorious Angel of Death escaped answering for his numerous atrocities during his lifetime. After their encounter, Rolf decided to alter his identity and sever ties with his past. It is speculated that he is now a retired attorney, leading a quiet existence somewhere in Germany. The story of Rolf Mengele is one of the most morally complex in the entire legacy of the Third Reich. A man who hated his father, knew his father was a monster, and yet chose silence over justice. That choice protected a murderer. It was also, in human terms, at least partly comprehensible. What would you do if it was your father? Wolf Hess, son of Rudolf Hess, who held the position of deputy Führer to Adolf Hitler from 1933 until 1941, took yet another path. Rudolf Hess had made the extraordinary and still partially unexplained decision to fly solo to Scotland in 1941, apparently in an attempt to negotiate a separate peace with Britain. He was captured and subsequently put on trial at Nuremberg at the war's end. Although he evaded execution, Hess was condemned to spend the rest of his days in Spandau prison, where he died on the 17th of August 1987, aged 93, in what remained officially a suicide but which Wolf Hess spent his life insisting was an assassination by his British captors. Rather than distancing himself from his father's legacy, Wolf Hess spent his life defending him. Wolf was a staunch supporter of his father, dedicating many years to an attempt to change public perception. He tirelessly campaigned to prove his father was not a war criminal, but rather a man carrying out his duties in the 1930s and early 1940s. During the 1950s, Wolf established the Committee to Free Rudolf Hess, amassing several 100,000 supporters, including some notable figures in German politics. He authored numerous books advocating for the recognition of Hess as a German hero rather than a criminal. Wolf, who spent his entire life defending his father's Nazi affiliations, passed away in 2001. Between Gudrun Himmler, who defended a man who ran the Holocaust, and Wolf Hess, who spent decades campaigning for the release of a man who had served as Hitler's personal deputy, one sees the terrible human persistence of loyalty even in the face of historical condemnation. What was happening to these children was not simply the normal loyalty of children to parents, it was the aftermath of a system that had been uniquely designed to make ideology personal, to make the Nazi cause inseparable from family identity, from personal worth, from the meaning of individual existence. Hitler understood, better than almost any other political leader of his century, that ideology is most powerful when it is internalized as identity. He did not just want people to obey the Nazi Party. He wanted them to be the Nazi Party, to feel that their personal dignity, their racial pride, their place in the historical narrative of the German people was inseparable from loyalty to National Socialism and to him personally. That is why so many members of the inner circle and their families remained loyal even after the catastrophic evidence of what the regime had done was laid out before them. The ideology had not been a hat that could be taken off. It had been a skin. Albert Speer Jr., born on July 29, 1934 in Berlin, just days. before Hitler ascended to the position of Führer, provides perhaps the most intellectually interesting case among the children of the Nazi leadership. His father, Albert Speer Sr., was Hitler's primary architect and Germany's armaments minister, a man who utilized his extraordinary organizational skills to sustain the weapons production that, relying heavily on forced labor, effectively extended the duration of the war by years. Post his conviction at the Nuremberg trials and a subsequent 20-year imprisonment sentence, Speer Sr. emerged as one of the few high-ranking Nazis who showed what appeared to be genuine regret for the atrocities committed by the regime. He became in some ways the acceptable Nazi, the one who admitted complicity and expressed remorse, though historians have long debated whether his remorse was genuine or calculated. Following his father's incarceration for war crimes, the Speer family took refuge with Albert Jr.'s grandparents in Heidelberg. During this period, Albert Jr. developed a severe stutter, which he eventually managed to overcome. He initially trained as a carpenter before shifting his focus to architecture. Albert Jr. was adamant that his career choice of architecture was not influenced by his father. In an interview with Süddeutsche Zeitung in 2010, he refrained from discussing his father, who passed away in 1981. He said, "I have tried my whole life to separate myself from my father, to distance myself." Albert Jr. passed away at his Frankfurt residence on September 15th at the age of 83. His life, defined by the effort to escape an inheritance he had done nothing to earn, represents one more human cost of the system that Hitler built. Now, what about the women who were married to the men of Hitler's inner circle? The wives of the Nazi leadership represent another dimension in which Hitler's system produced consequences unlike anything comparable in the history of other dictatorships. Most authoritarian regimes do not systematically destroy the lives of their leaders' families upon collapse. The wives of Stalin's inner circle lived in varying states of privilege and terror during his reign, but generally survived it. The wives of the ruling families in authoritarian states across the 20th century, from Spain to Portugal, to Chile, to Argentina, to Iraq, were typically either protected by their husband's power during its exercise or discreetly rehabilitated after its fall. The wives of Hitler's inner circle faced a specific and peculiar combination of accountability, denial, and complicated survival. They had occupied positions of enormous social power and privilege in a state that was simultaneously making war on the world and systematically murdering millions. What did they know? What did they choose not to know? And what happened to them when the war was over? Ilse Hess led a life marked by her unwavering allegiance to the Nazi Party and her marriage to Rudolf Hess, Adolf Hitler's deputy. She became Rudolf Hess's steadfast companion, standing by his side through the turbulent years of the Third Reich. Ilse and Rudolf Hess met in the early 1920s, and their relationship blossomed amidst the rising tide of National Socialism. In 1921, she initially joined the Nazi Party, and then rejoined in 1925 after the party had been temporarily banned. She was initially attracted to Rudolf Hess, but he hesitated to pursue a relationship. Ilse introduced Hess to Adolf Hitler, who actively engaged in social events hosted by affluent women. Hitler played a significant role in facilitating and influencing the marriage between Ilse and Hess, which occurred on December 20, 1927 in Munich. Moreover, Hitler stood as the godfather to their only child, Wolf Hess, born in 1937. Throughout the war, Ilse remained a steadfast supporter of the Nazi regime. Her loyalty was most evident when her husband embarked on his solo flight to Scotland. Despite the repercussions of his ill-fated mission, Ilse staunchly defended his intentions and continued to stand by the party. After World War II, Ilse Hess was arrested and shipped off to an internment camp in Augsburg. When released, she moved to Allgäu and opened a boarding house by 1955. She was a steadfast believer in National Socialism and remained devoted to Adolf Hitler and his ideologies until her demise. Post-war, she provided support to Stille Hilfe, a relief organization for arrested, condemned and fugitive SS members. Her controversial book, England, Nürnberg, Spandau, Ein Schicksal in Briefen, published in 1952, gained some attention, and among her correspondents were known admirers of Hitler. Her later years were spent advocating for her husband's release from Spandau prison, where he was held until his death in 1987. Ilse Hess passed away on September 7, 1995, leaving behind a complex legacy intertwined with the troubled history of Nazi Germany. Margaret Himmler was the wife of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. In a twist of irony, Margarete Himmler was initially trained as a nurse with the noble intention of saving lives during World War I. After the war, she transitioned to the German Red Cross Hospital and even managed a private nursing clinic. Margaret first crossed paths with Heinrich during one of his lecture tours in 1927. His attraction to her was immediate, captivated by her blue eyes and blonde hair. They married in July the following year, despite Heinrich's initial apprehension about introducing Margaret to his Catholic family due to their age difference and her previous marriage. The couple welcomed their daughter Gudrun into the world on August 8, 1929. Margaret was far from a passive spectator in her husband's activities. She became a member of the Nazi Party in 1928 and regularly arranged gatherings for the spouses of high-ranking SS leaders. By the end of 1939, Margaret was overseeing the operation of Red Cross hospitals throughout Berlin-Brandenburg, and her role sent her on missions to countries under German Wehrmacht occupation. In her diary, there is a noted trip to Poland in March 1940, confirming her eyewitness account of events unfolding there. Margaret wrote of the Jewish population she saw there with language that reveals how thoroughly the Nazi racial ideology had penetrated even those who were not part of the killing apparatus. In April 1945, Margaret and Heinrich Himmler shared a final moment before his death. Their marriage had effectively ended years before, with Margaret discovering in 1941 that Heinrich was secretly entangled with his secretary, with whom he had 2 children. When the war concluded, Margaret was subjected to numerous investigations probing the extent of her knowledge regarding her husband's affairs. She denied any awareness and pleaded to be cleared of Nazi association. After a prolonged deliberation, in 1953 she was deemed a profiteer of the Nazi regime and sentenced to 30 days of penal labour. Consequently, she was stripped of her voting rights and pension eligibility. After her release, she lived under the pseudonym Margaret Boden until her death in 1967, trying to distance herself from her past. Emmy Goering married the prominent Luftwaffe chief and Nazi, Hermann Goering, on April 10, 1935. Interestingly, even though Emmy didn't actively seek membership, she was gifted Nazi Party induction as a Christmas present in 1938. Emmy Goering held the responsibility of being Hitler's hostess at numerous state functions before the start of World War II. Her self-proclaimed status as the First Lady of the Third Reich led to a significant rift with Hitler's companion, Eva Braun, whom Emmy openly disregarded and treated with disdain. This behavior resulted in Hitler demanding Hermann Goering to instruct Emmy to treat Eva with due respect. One consequence of Emmy's disdainful attitude was her exclusion from Hitler's Bavarian retreat, the Berghof. Eva Braun reportedly held a grudge against Emmy for her assumption of being the First Lady of the Reich. Emmy was in a position of significant power and wealth in Europe, enjoying a lavish lifestyle during World War II. Her husband's ownership of mansions, estates and castles in Austria, Germany and Poland, garnered from the confiscation of art and wealth from Jews and others classified as enemies by the Nazi regime, were testaments to their opulence. Upon their daughter Edda's birth, Hermann Goering commanded a tribute of 500 planes to fly over Berlin, stating that he would have doubled the number had it been a boy. After the war, a German denazification court found Emmy guilty of being a Nazi, leading to a year-long incarceration. After her release, a portion of her wealth, amounting to 30%, was seized, and she was prohibited from performing on stage for 5 years. She managed to get a tiny apartment for herself in Munich and wrote an autobiography called My Life with Goering. Emmy passed away in Munich on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80. Lena Heydrich represents perhaps the most morally complex case among the wives of the Nazi inner circle. Her brother Hans was an ardent member of the Nazi Party and the SA, and his high praise of the party led Lena to a rally in 1929 where Adolf Hitler delivered a speech that greatly impacted her, prompting her to join the Nazi Party herself. It was during a rowing club ball in Kiel at the age of 19 that she met Naval Lieutenant Reinhard Heydrich, eventually leading to their engagement. However, the subsequent year saw Heydrich facing charges of conduct unbecoming an officer for violating an engagement promise to another woman. This led to his dismissal from the Navy in April, leaving him without a career. It was Lena who suggested the possibility of a career in the newly established SS. Heydrich's ideas for an SS intelligence service prompted Heinrich Himmler to immediately appoint him as the chief of the newly formed intelligence service, known later as the SD. As an acknowledgement of her husband's dedication to the Nazi cause, Hitler gifted Lena with a large estate in rural Bohemia, where she kept several prisoners for forced labor and where, it is alleged, she physically abused them. The family resided there until April 1945, when they escaped the closing Soviet Red Army. After World War II, Lena was acquitted in the denazification proceedings. Through court battles against the West German government in 1956 and 1959, she successfully secured a pension, a contentious decision given her husband's significant role in designing and implementing the Holocaust's machinery. Despite her conviction and sentencing to life imprisonment in absentia by Czechoslovakia, she managed to avoid serving the sentence. In 1965, she married Finnish theatre director Mauno Manninen, primarily to change her surname. In 1976, she wrote a memoir called Life with a War Criminal, in which she tirelessly defended her first husband's reputation. She died at the age of 74 on August 14, 1985. What these stories reveal is a pattern that is genuinely unusual in the history of dictatorships. In most authoritarian systems, the regime's ideology exists primarily as a tool of control. The wives of Soviet officials did not generally believe in Marxism-Leninism with the fervor of religious converts. They believed in the privileges that proximity to power brought them. The wives of most 20th century dictators were people who had made pragmatic choices, trading political compliance for social position. Some were true believers. Most were not. But among the wives of Hitler's inner circle, the ideological commitment appears to have been, in many cases, genuinely deep. Women like Ilse Hess and Lena Heydrich were not simply passive beneficiaries of their husband's power. They were active participants in the ideology. They had joined the Nazi Party themselves, in some cases, before their husbands had become prominent. They had internalized the racial worldview, the anti-Semitism, the nationalism, the sense of historical destiny. And when the regime collapsed, they could not simply shed those beliefs the way a coat can be shed when the weather changes. The beliefs were them. This is what Hitler built that no other dictator built, a state whose ideology was so comprehensively internalized by its participants that it survived the physical destruction of the state itself. The denazification courts struggled precisely because they were trying to assess political guilt in people whose political convictions had become indistinguishable from personal identity. Now let us turn to one of the most revealing examples of how Hitler's approach to power differed from every other dictator in modern history, and that is the question of his military instrument, particularly the Waffen-SS. Every major authoritarian regime has had its elite forces, its Praetorian Guard, its specially selected troops loyal primarily to the leader rather than to the state. Stalin had the NKVD. Mao had the People's Liberation Army's personal guard units. Saddam Hussein had the Republican Guard and the Fedayeen. But none of these forces were organized around the principle that their defining loyalty was to a racial ideology rather than to a leader or a state. The Waffen-SS was something new in the history of human warfare. It was Hitler's elite soldiers, feared on every front, marked by their black uniforms and ruthless reputation. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, their war was not immediately over. Some were hunted and tried, others vanished or quietly rebuilt their lives in post-war Germany. Decades later, they would fight one last battle, not with weapons, but over history itself. The Waffen-SS was unique because it was built on a principle that no other military force in history had ever formally institutionalized: racial qualification for service. You could not be a member of the Waffen-SS simply by volunteering. You had to be certified as racially Aryan by SS racial examiners who measured skull shapes, examined genealogical records going back generations, and assessed physical characteristics according to a pseudo-scientific racial taxonomy that Hitler had adopted from an intellectual tradition that had more in common with 19th century crank anthropology than with any genuine science. This meant that the Waffen-SS was, from its first moment of existence, not just an army unit, but a racial statement. It was the embodiment in human form of Hitler's central ideological claim, that some people were biologically superior and that those superior people should lead and those inferior people should serve or be eliminated. The legal reckoning came quickly after the war. At the Nuremberg trials held from November 1945 to October 1946, prosecutors argued that the entire SS, including the Waffen-SS, had been a key instrument of Nazi crimes. On September 30th, 1946, the International Military Tribunal formally declared the SS a criminal organization. That judgment meant that simply belonging to the Waffen-SS could constitute a crime, though exceptions were made for those conscripted after 1943 or proven to have avoided ideological involvement. Denazification courts sprang up across occupied Germany, sorting millions of former Nazis into categories from major offenders to followers. For Waffen-SS members, verdicts depended heavily on rank, theatre of service, and local politics. A few well-known figures, such as SS Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division, were tried and imprisoned for atrocities in France and Belgium. Others faced military tribunals for their roles in Italy, the Balkans, or the Eastern Front, but the vast majority of lower-ranking men were released within months, their records marked but their lives largely intact. Conditions in post-war camps were harsh. Many prisoners were kept in improvised enclosures under the open sky, struggling with disease, hunger, and uncertainty. Allied authorities, faced with millions of detainees, focused on identifying high-ranking or notorious offenders. Those not immediately prosecuted were gradually released during 1946 and 1947, often with no clear future. Some returned to ruined towns in Germany or Austria. Others drifted through displaced persons camps in Allied zones. A minority chose flight. With forged papers and sympathetic networks, a number of ex-Waffen-SS officers escaped Europe altogether. Karl Nicolosi Lech, a former panzer commander, reached Argentina in 1948, where he built a quiet life under Juan Perón's regime. Similar routes took fugitives to Spain, Syria, and even Egypt. These escapes later fueled stories of Nazi ratlines organized by clerical or intelligence circles, claims that remain partly documented and partly debated. For those who stayed, the early post-war years brought disillusionment. The name Waffen-SS had become synonymous with brutality and fanaticism. Their veterans were excluded from employment, pensions, and even from official war grave commemorations. By 1948, Germany's new political authorities, under Allied supervision, still considered the Waffen-SS a criminal entity, not a branch of the army. In less than 3 years, a force that had once numbered nearly 1 million men was reduced to scattered individuals, each facing judgment or obscurity. Their collective reputation was sealed in the courtroom at Nuremberg, but their individual fates were only beginning to unfold. The creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949 marked a new chapter not only for the nation, but also for the men who had worn the black uniform. The country's first leaders, tasked with rebuilding society under Allied supervision, inherited a population that included hundreds of thousands of former Nazi Party members and soldiers. Among them were many ex-Waffen-SS men, often younger, battle-scarred and politically toxic. For the Western Allies, the initial stance was clear. The Waffen-SS remained a criminal organization, and its veterans were to be excluded from civil service, pensions, and public employment. But West Germany's rapid reconstruction soon collided with the practical realities of reintegrating millions of demobilized soldiers. As the Cold War deepened, political pragmatism began to outweigh strict denazification. The new state needed stability and votes. By the early 1950s, political debates over veteran welfare dominated the Bundestag. The introduction of the Bundesversorgungsgesetz, the Federal War Victims Relief Act of 1950, became a turning point. Designed to support disabled veterans and war widows, it ignited fierce controversy. Should men of the Waffen-SS receive benefits like regular Wehrmacht soldiers? Conservative politicians, including Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, eventually agreed that excluding them would risk alienating a large and organized voter base. In 1953, Adenauer publicly declared that the men of the Waffen-SS had fought as soldiers, just like others. That statement carried heavy symbolic weight. It signaled West Germany's quiet shift toward normalizing Waffen-SS veterans as part of the broader soldier community. In practice, it meant many former SS men could now claim limited pensions, especially those who could show post-1943 conscription rather than voluntary enlistment. By 1956, the question extended to the newly formed Bundeswehr, West Germany's modern army. In theory, former SS men could serve again. In practice, only a fraction were accepted. Records show that by September 1956, out of 3,117 former Waffen-SS applicants, just 508 were approved. The rest were rejected for ideological concerns, criminal records, or pressure from Allied advisors who feared the Bundeswehr could inherit a tainted legacy. What the story of the Waffen-SS in the post-war period reveals is, again, something distinctive about Hitler's system. When the Nazi state collapsed, it did not simply leave behind discredited former officials who could slowly be reintegrated into society, which is roughly what happened in most post-authoritarian transitions. It left behind people whose identity was so deeply bound up in the ideology of the regime that simple legal rehabilitation could not address the moral questions. The Waffen-SS veterans who were released from captivity in 1946 and 1947 were not simply former soldiers returning to civilian life, as Wehrmacht veterans were encouraged to see themselves. They were members of an organization that had been declared criminal, that had participated in mass murder on an industrial scale, and that had built its entire identity on a racial ideology that the rest of the world had just spent 6 years fighting and dying to defeat. What do you do with such men? Germany struggled with that question for decades, and the struggle itself is one of the most revealing aspects of what Hitler created that no other dictator created before or since. Let us now look more deeply at one of the most striking contrasts between Hitler and other dictators, the question of strategic rationality. History's most successful authoritarian rulers, whatever their crimes, have generally been strategically rational. They understood the relationship between ends and means. They made decisions about war and peace based on assessments of national interest, however brutally those interests were defined. They entered conflicts that they had at least a reasonable chance of winning. They made alliances that served their interests. They avoided fighting enemies they could not defeat, while simultaneously fighting enemies they already faced. These principles of strategic rationality are so basic to statecraft that they have been understood since at least the time of Sun Tzu and Thucydides. Hitler violated virtually all of them, and the pattern of his violations tells us something profound about why he was unlike every other dictator in history. Consider the sequence of Hitler's strategic decisions in the year 1941 alone. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union through Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in human history, while the Battle of the Atlantic was still unresolved and Britain had not been subdued. This decision divided Germany's military resources between two major theatres of war, something that Germany's strategic planners had considered catastrophic since at least the First World War. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's pre-WWI strategic framework, had been designed precisely to avoid a two-front war. Hitler dismissed this concern because his ideology told him that the Soviet Union was a racially inferior state that would collapse rapidly once struck. When the Soviet Union did not collapse rapidly, the decision became strategically catastrophic. But ideology had overridden strategy, as it always did with Hitler. Then, in December 1941, 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States. He was under no treaty obligation to do so. The tripartite pact between Germany, Japan, and Italy required Germany to come to Japan's defense only if Japan was attacked, not if Japan attacked someone else. Japan had attacked the United States. Hitler's declaration of war on America was a voluntary choice. It brought the industrial and military power of the United States, with its population of 130 million people and its enormous manufacturing capacity, fully and unreservedly into the European war. No rational strategic calculation could justify this decision. Germany was already fighting the Soviet Union and had not yet defeated Britain. Adding America to the list of enemies was simply insane from a strategic perspective. So why did Hitler do it? Because his ideology required it. His racial worldview held that America was controlled by Jewish interests, that the Jewish conspiracy behind American democracy and American capitalism would inevitably bring America into the war against Germany, and that therefore declaring war on America was simply accelerating the inevitable. This was not strategic thinking. This was apocalyptic racial fantasy masquerading as strategic thinking, and it cost Germany the war. Other major dictators have made strategic errors, sometimes catastrophic ones. Stalin's refusal to believe the intelligence warnings about German preparations for Operation Barbarossa in the spring of 1941 was an act of strategic denial that contributed directly to the disasters of the first months of the Soviet-German War. Mao's decision to enter the Korean War in October 1950 was a massive gamble that cost China enormous casualties and resources. But these errors, however costly, were at least comprehensible in terms of the leader's strategic frameworks. Stalin's denial of the Barbarossa warnings was based on the rational, if mistaken, calculation that Hitler would not open a second front until Britain was defeated. Mao's Korean intervention was based on the rational, if costly, calculation that a unified pro-American Korea on China's border would be an existential threat to the new communist government. Hitler's declaration of war on America was not rational in any framework that privileged national survival over ideological consistency. It was the act of a man who, having decided that the fate of the world was determined by racial struggle, could not make strategic decisions that contradicted that framework even when those decisions were manifestly suicidal. This brings us to the question of what the German military made of the enemies they faced, and what those assessments reveal about the system in which they served. After the war, when German generals were systematically interrogated by Allied intelligence, their opinions of Allied commanders tell a story that reflects directly on the nature of Hitler's command. General Alfred Jodel's assessment of George Patton as the American Guderian was not merely a compliment to an enemy commander. It was implicitly a commentary on what the German army had lost as Hitler's grip tightened. The generals who admired Patton, Guderian, Blumentritt and others were admiring in an Allied general the very qualities that Hitler had systematically destroyed in his own officer corps: initiative, aggressive movement, willingness to take calculated risks and freedom from micromanagement. Heinz Guderian, the mastermind behind Germany's Blitzkrieg strategy, had said of Patton, "I hear much about General Patton, and he conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." That phrase, "as I would have done had I been in his place," is significant. Guderian was not describing what German commanders were actually doing by 1944 and 1945. He was describing what they had been able to do in 1940 and 1941, before Hitler's interference had become all-pervasive. The tragedy of German operational genius in the Second World War is that it existed most fully in those first 2 years, before Hitler's increasingly autocratic control strangled it. The German view of British forces was equally revealing. General Siegfried Westphal, a high-ranking German officer, once remarked that the hardest, toughest in attack and most persistent in defence were the British divisions. German military assessments consistently highlighted the uniformity of British personnel and their remarkable absence of failures in key battles. There was something special in the British fighting spirit that impressed even those who fought against them. Despite this admiration for British troops, German commanders often viewed British leadership as overly cautious. In the fast-paced world of mechanised warfare, hesitation could be deadly. General Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, expressed this frustration when he said to captured British officers after the siege of Tobruk, "Gentlemen, you have fought like lions and been led by donkeys." Of course, no discussion of German views on the British would be complete without mentioning Hitler's own perspective, which was a fascinating mixture of grudging respect, racial admiration, and ideological resentment. In Hitler's mind, the British were potential natural allies for Germany. He saw them as fellow Aryans, a group he believed should be working with Germany rather than against it. His bizarre worldview allowed him to justify his war against Britain while maintaining a twisted form of respect based on the claim that Jews were manipulating the British, turning them against their natural Germanic brothers. This delusional framework shaped German strategy in ways that were sometimes militarily helpful, as in Hitler's controversial decision to halt the German advance at Dunkirk in May 1940, which allowed the British evacuation of more than 330,000 Allied troops, a decision that some historians have attributed partly to Hitler's belief that a generous gesture might induce Britain to negotiate, and sometimes, militarily, catastrophic. The German perception of Soviet forces underwent a particularly dramatic transformation during the war, and that transformation tells us something important about the difference between Hitler's ideological certainties and military reality. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, many German commanders viewed the Soviet Union as an easy target. They saw the Red Army as poorly equipped, badly led, and incapable of standing up to the Wehrmacht's superior tactics and technology. Nazi racial theories painted Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, or subhumans. This view led many German officers to believe that Soviet soldiers would simply crumble in the face of German strength. Field Marshal Paul Ludwig von Kleist, reflecting on this shift in perception, stated, "From the very beginning, the Russians proved themselves first-class warriors. Our successes in the first months of the war can be explained by better training. Having gained combat experience, the Russians became first-class soldiers, and they fought with exceptional perseverance and had astounding endurance." Franz Halder, the Chief of Staff of the Army High Command, said about the Soviet Army that enemy troops, on the initiative of the new command and also perhaps under the influence of England, were making every effort to hold the front line and not allow German forces to move further east, and that Russian troops were fighting with the greatest tenacity and severity. The evolution in German thinking from contempt to genuine fear as the war progressed had profound strategic implications. Hitler never fully shared this evolution. He continued to believe, in contradiction to the evidence accumulating on the Eastern Front, that Soviet resistance was the product of Jewish Bolshevik terror rather than genuine military capability. When his generals told him that the Soviet army was larger, better equipped, and more capable than pre-war estimates had suggested, he accused them of cowardice or defeatism. The ideology came first. The evidence came nowhere. This brings us to the most dramatic and final way in which Hitler was the opposite of every other dictator in modern history. The question of how he ended. Think about what happens to most dictators when their power finally collapses. Mussolini was captured by Italian partisans while attempting to flee to Switzerland, executed on April 28, 1945, and his body hung upside down at a Milan petrol station. He tried to flee. He hoped for survival. Saddam Hussein was captured by American forces on December 13, 2003, hiding in an underground hole near Tikrit, disheveled, disoriented, and apparently dazed. He tried to hide. He hoped for survival. Muammar Gaddafi was captured by rebel forces on October 20, 2011, in Sirte, dragged from a drainage pipe and summarily executed. He tried to escape. He hoped for survival. Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena attempted to flee Romania by helicopter on December 22, 1989, were captured and were executed by firing squad on Christmas Day. They tried to flee. They hoped for survival. Even Benito Mussolini's patron and ideological inspiration in many ways, the man who had shown that fascism was viable as a governing system, ran in the end. Even Stalin died in his bed, surrounded by terrified subordinates apparently suffering from a stroke that his inner circle delayed treating for fear of his wrath. He did not die fighting. He did not choose death over surrender. Only Adolf Hitler, in the entire catalogue of modern dictators, chose to die in the same city he had sought to defend to the last, in the same country he had led to catastrophe, at the moment of total defeat by his own hand. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the Führer bunker from a few city blocks away, Hitler shot himself in the right temple while simultaneously biting down on a cyanide capsule. His body was then burned in accordance with instructions he had left so that it would not be displayed by the Soviets as Mussolini's body had been displayed. Eva Braun, whom he had finally married the night before in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker, also took cyanide. Why did Hitler choose this end? Why did he not follow the pattern of virtually every other major dictator in history and at least attempt escape or negotiation? The answer lies in something that is, in a deeply perverse way, consistent with everything else about him. His ideology required it. a man who had spent 12 years telling Germany that it faced an apocalyptic racial struggle for its very existence, that defeat meant the biological annihilation of the German people, that there was no middle ground and no possibility of compromise, could not, without utterly destroying everything he had claimed to believe, choose survival over death at the moment of final defeat. His suicide was the final act of a man who had never separated himself from the ideology he embodied. For Hitler, to surrender was not just to admit military defeat. It was to admit that the racial worldview was wrong, that the Jews had not been controlling the Allies, that German blood was not inherently superior, that the whole edifice of beliefs to which he had devoted his life was false. He could not do that, so he died instead. This is profoundly different from the strategic calculation of self-preservation that has governed the ends of virtually all other dictators. Mussolini did not die fighting for fascism because he believed fascism required his death. He tried to escape because he wanted to live. Saddam Hussein did not die in his hole because Baathism required martyrdom. He hid because he wanted to live. Even the most fanatical ideological dictators of the 20th century, men like Pol Pot, who presided over the killing of a quarter of Cambodia's population, eventually retreated and sought the protection of Thai border areas, dying under house arrest in 1998. Only Hitler made his own death a logical conclusion of his ideology rather than a surrender to its failure. And in doing so, he created something that no other dictator has ever quite created, a genuine mystery about what would have happened if he had lived. Other dictators who were captured and tried, Saddam Hussein, Charles Taylor of Liberia, Slobodan Milosevic, who died before the verdict, contributed directly to the development of international justice and the creation of norms around the prosecution of crimes against humanity. Hitler's suicide short-circuited that process entirely. He was never tried. He never had to answer for the Holocaust in a courtroom. He never had to look at the evidence and offer a defense. He died having given the world no final reckoning, no testimony, no confession. The closest thing to a testament he left was the political will he dictated in the bunker on April 29, 1945, in which he blamed the Jews for the war, blamed his generals for the military disasters, expelled Goering and Himmler from the party for their attempted negotiations, appointed Dönitz as his successor, and urged future Germans to continue the racial struggle. It was the act of a man who died exactly as he had lived, convinced that he was right, convinced that the world was wrong, and convinced that history would eventually vindicate him. Now, let us look at one of the most significant and often underappreciated ways in which Hitler was the opposite of other dictators, and that concerns the machinery of genocide itself. No other modern dictator built an industrial genocide as the central purpose of his state. This is not simply a quantitative distinction, although the numbers are almost incomprehensible. 6 million Jewish people murdered in the Holocaust, along with approximately 5 to 6 million others, including Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, disabled people, Roma, Sinti, homosexuals, and political prisoners. It is a qualitative distinction. Stalin killed more people in absolute terms if you include the Soviet famine of 1932 and 1933. Mao's Great Leap Forward killed more people by some estimates. But neither Stalin nor Mao built their entire state around the goal of eliminating a specific biological group from the face of the earth. For Stalin, mass killing was primarily a tool of political control and forced modernization. When the political purpose changed, the killing stopped or redirected. For Mao, the mass death of the Great Leap Forward was an unwanted byproduct of catastrophically misguided agricultural policy. Mao did not intend to kill those 30 million people. He intended to industrialize China rapidly and was catastrophically wrong about how to do it. Hitler intended to kill every Jewish person in Europe. That was not a byproduct. It was the goal. The Holocaust was not what happened while Hitler was fighting the war. The war was, in significant part, what happened while Hitler was implementing the Holocaust. When Allied bombing and advancing Soviet armies made it clear that the final solution was going to fail because the German state was collapsing, the SS actually accelerated the killing. In the final year of the war, when German resources were at their most strained and the military situation was obviously catastrophic, the trains carrying Jewish deportees to the death camps were sometimes given priority over military supplies. This was not a rational decision from any strategic perspective. It was the act of a man who was willing to lose the war rather than halt the genocide, because the genocide was more important to him than the war. The machinery that produced this genocide was the Waffen-SS and the broader SS structure, and the story of what happened to that machinery after the war is one of the most sobering chapters in modern history. In the early 1950s, as West Germany rose from the ruins, former Waffen-SS officers began to organize. In 1951, a group led by Paul Hauser, Otto Kumm and Felix Steiner founded HIAG, the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, translated roughly as the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members. HIAG started as a welfare organization to support comrades denied state pensions and benefits. But it quickly evolved into something larger, a political and historical lobby. Its founders were former generals, articulate and well-connected, who believed the Waffen-SS had been unfairly condemned as a criminal organization. Their central argument was simple but powerful. The Waffen-SS, they claimed, had been an apolitical fighting force, soldiers like any other. This narrative found an audience. West Germany's conservative politicians, facing tight elections and keen to mobilize veterans' votes, began to court HIAG. Chancellor Adenauer met privately with its leaders, and prominent figures like Franz Josef Strauss addressed veteran rallies. By the mid-1950s, HIAG had branches across West Germany and claimed tens of thousands of members. It published magazines such as Der Freiwillige, The Volunteer, organized reunions, and even financed the publication of memoirs that reframed SS divisions as elite military units rather than ideological forces. Paul Hauser's 1953 book, Soldaten wie andere auch, Soldiers Like Any Other, became the cornerstone of this myth. HIAG's influence peaked in the 1960s. Some former SS officers managed to secure public positions and commemorative events, for Waffen-SS divisions were often covered by local media without criticism. But as Germany's younger generation confronted the Nazi past more directly during the 1970s, public tolerance began to erode. In 1978, a Der Spiegel investigation revealed HIAG's deep political ties and attempts to pressure officials on pension reforms. The scandal marked a turning point. By 1992, facing dwindling ranks and public disapproval, HIAG officially dissolved. What is the significance of HIAG for our understanding of Hitler's uniqueness among dictators? It is this. No other modern dictatorship produced a comparable organization of former regime functionaries who spent decades systematically trying to rehabilitate the reputation of an organization formally declared criminal by an international tribunal. The former officials of other collapsed authoritarian regimes did not, in general, organize themselves into pressure groups to claim that they had been misunderstood. Former Stasi officers did not form the Mutual Aid Association of former East German Security Service members and lobby the reunified German government for pensions. Former SAVAK officers in post-revolutionary Iran did not form veterans organizations claiming they had been soldiers like any other. The Waffen-SS veterans who founded HIAG were doing something qualitatively different from the reintegration of former soldiers that happens after virtually every war and every regime transition. They were attempting to rehabilitate an ideology, to claim that the racial ideology of the Third Reich had been a legitimate, if perhaps imperfect, expression of German national interest, and that the men who had served it deserved recognition rather than condemnation. That attempt failed ultimately, but the fact that it was made at all for 4 decades by organized and politically connected groups tells us something about the depth and persistence of the ideological investment that Hitler had created. Let us also consider, in thinking about Hitler's singular nature among dictators, the question of his relationship with Eva Braun. Here, too, the contrast with other dictators is striking. Virtually every major dictator in the 20th century had complicated personal lives, often characterized by multiple relationships, public consorts, and family structures that served political purposes. Stalin's family life was marked by tragedy. His first wife died of typhus in 1907, his second wife committed suicide in 1932, and his relationships with his children, particularly his son Yakov and his daughter Svetlana, were marked by coldness and psychological damage. But Stalin did not hide his family. His second wife Nadezhda was a public figure. His children were known. For most dictators, a family, however dysfunctional, serves a propaganda purpose. It humanizes, it domesticates, it presents the image of a normal life. Hitler kept Eva Braun almost entirely secret from the German public for the entirety of his rule. Most German citizens did not know she existed. She lived in enforced obscurity in his private residences, forbidden from being photographed with him in public, forbidden from attending official functions, forbidden from being acknowledged as his companion. He finally married her in the bunker less than 40 hours before their deaths together in a ceremony that had no political function and no public significance. Why this secrecy? Partly because Hitler had cultivated an image of himself as the heroic bachelor devoted entirely to Germany, in whose love for the German people there was no room for personal romantic attachment. But partly surely because Eva Braun did not fit the ideological ideal of the German woman as wife, mother, and racial producer of Aryan children. She was young, relatively uneducated, politically disengaged, and personally devoted to Hitler in a way that had nothing to do with his political mission. She represented the private man behind the public dictator, and the private man was profoundly incompatible with the public mythology. The Emmy Goering story illuminates this dynamic from a different angle. When Emmy Goering claimed the title of First Lady of the Third Reich as Hermann Goering's wife and Hitler's hostess at state functions, she was treading on territory that Hitler found politically uncomfortable. The rift that developed between Emmy Goering and Eva Braun was not merely a social conflict between two women. It was, at some level, a conflict between the public face of power and the private reality of Hitler's personal life. Eva Braun reportedly held a grudge against Emmy for her assumption of social precedence, and Hitler's demand that Hermann Goering instruct Emmy to treat Eva with due respect reveals something telling. That Hitler did care about Eva's dignity, that she did matter to him personally, but that he could not acknowledge her publicly without undermining the carefully constructed mythology of his own persona. Hitler's response was to exclude Emmy Goering from his Berghof retreat, demonstrating once again the fundamental dynamic of his system. Personal preference exercised through the mechanism of exclusion, withdrawal of favour, and the power to banish. This was how he ruled his inner circle, not primarily through formal authority, though that existed, but through the constant arbitrary manipulation of access and favour. And it created, over time, an inner circle that was not bound together by institutional loyalty or shared purpose, but by individual competition for a single man's approval. That is not how successful states are run. It is how courts are run. And in the end, it is what the Third Reich was. Not a modern state, not even a fascist state in any theoretically coherent sense, but a personal court organized around the will and whim of one individual, extended to a scale that had never been attempted before in human history. The U-boat fleet that Admiral Dönitz had commanded with such devastating effectiveness provides one of the most striking metaphors for the broader story of Hitler's Reich and its end. When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, more than 100 U-boats were still at sea. In the days that followed, they surfaced in quiet harbours across Europe, their war finally over. What came next was unprecedented. Hundreds of submarines captured, studied, and deliberately destroyed. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. Within hours, Dönitz issued a simple but historic order. All U-boats are to cease operations, surface, and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. The long war beneath the Atlantic was over. Across the North Atlantic, the Bay of Biscay and the fjords of Norway, more than 150 U-boats surfaced, their exhausted crews hoisting white flags as Allied aircraft circled overhead. They sailed toward ports such as Loch Erebol in Scotland, Lissahalli in Northern Ireland, and Portland in southern England, each arrival marking the quiet collapse of the Wolfpack fleet that had once haunted Allied shipping lanes. The surrender process was tightly controlled. Allied warships escorted the submarines into port, where Royal Navy and US Navy boarding parties seized codes, charts, and weapons. Engineers catalogued the rusted, battle-scarred vessels, many barely seaworthy after months underwater. At Loch Erebol, nearly 40 U-boats anchored together in a grim parade of defeat. The U-boat campaign, which from 1939 to May 1943 had brought Britain to the edge of strangulation by attacking the supply convoys across the Atlantic with horrifying effectiveness, represents one of the most genuinely dangerous strategic threats that Germany posed to Allied victory. But even here, in the domain of naval warfare, Hitler's ideology eventually overrode strategic rationality. The U-boats were most effective when they were used as a strategic instrument to cut Britain off from American supplies. Their effectiveness was maximized by coordination, by the wolfpack tactics that Dönitz had perfected, by careful management of when and where to deploy limited resources. But Hitler repeatedly interfered with Dönitz's strategic direction of the campaign, insisting on diverting submarines to secondary theatres, demanding that they protect Norway against an Allied invasion that never came, and refusing to accept professional naval advice about the optimal use of this crucial resource. The result was that the U-boat campaign, which might have been prosecuted with even greater strategic effect if managed by professionals without interference, was instead managed as a personal instrument of Hitler's strategic fantasies. When the Allied anti-submarine campaign finally turned the tide in May 1943, when new technologies including radar, long-range patrol aircraft, and improved convoy tactics allowed the Allies to sink U-boats faster than Germany could replace them, the battle was effectively over. But the submarines kept sailing, kept dying, their crews dying in the steel cylinders beneath the Atlantic because Hitler's system could not acknowledge failure. Over 30,000 German submariners were killed during the war, roughly 3/4 of all U-boat crews who served. That casualty rate, among the highest of any military branch in any army in the Second World War, is testament to the cost of ideological warfare conducted by a leader who measured success in terms of ideological consistency rather than strategic rationality. In the following weeks after the surrender, Allied leaders faced a pressing question: what to do with the world's most advanced submarine fleet? The United States and Britain saw immense intelligence value in the revolutionary Type 21 and 23 designs, while the Soviet Union, entering the early Cold War, demanded its share of the captured technology. The captured German crews endured long months of captivity. Some were interrogated for intelligence, particularly engineers familiar with new propulsion systems or torpedo technology. Others languished in camps, uncertain of their fates. By late 1945, most were repatriated to a defeated, divided Germany. By year's end, harbours from Trondheim to Portsmouth were clogged with captured submarines. What came next, Operation Deadlight, would ensure that most of these machines never sailed again. Between November 1945 and February 1946, the Royal Navy carried out this quiet operation that erased most of the Kriegsmarine's undersea fleet from existence. In total, 156 U-boats had surrendered to the Allies, with 116 designated for destruction under Deadlight. The Royal Navy divided the operation into 3 dumping areas, roughly 100 to 120 nautical miles northwest of Ireland, where the submarines would be sunk either by naval gunfire, explosive charges, or simply by opening their sea valves. As a result, more than a third of the U-boats never made it to the scuttling zones. 56 vessels foundered or sank on the way, dragged down by rough weather or structural failure. Among the doomed submarines was U-2-336, the last U-boat to sink Allied ships during the war. It surrendered at Lisahalli in June 1945 and was deliberately sunk off Ireland in January 1946. Operation Deadlight had served its purpose, to erase the physical presence of Hitler's U-boat fleet. Yet its aftermath left an unintended legacy, a vast underwater graveyard stretching across the North Atlantic, silent testimony to the end of Germany's submarine war. Between 2001 and 2003, maritime archaeologist Innes McCartney led expeditions that rediscovered many of them. Using sonar and deep-sea photography, his team identified at least 14 intact U-boat hulls preserved in the cold Atlantic mud. The findings revealed how hastily the scuttlings had been carried out, many boats having sunk upright, their decks still armed, their steel now encrusted with coral and history. Not all U-boats were destroyed. The most advanced examples, the Type 21 and Type 23 boats, were spared for study. These represented the future of submarine design, featuring streamlined hulls and improved underwater endurance. British and American engineers examined several of them closely, reverse engineering their technologies for their own post-war fleets. The Soviet Union acquired several of the prized Type 21 boats, which served as direct templates for the later Whiskey-class submarines. Soviet shipyards dissected German hulls plate by plate, replicating the pressure-resistant architecture and snorkel systems that gave their new fleet a sudden technological leap. To the west, it was a worrying development. The same German engineering that once hunted Allied convoys was now fueling an arms race beneath the Arctic ice. In a strange and unintended way, the technological legacy of the Nazi war machine became one of the foundational elements of Cold War naval competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Particularly significant was U-234, a long-range cargo submarine captured on May 14, 1945, while en route to Japan with a secret payload that included uranium oxide and jet engine components. US Navy engineers studied its construction and cargo before sinking it during weapons tests in 1947. This single submarine, captured while still sailing toward an ally that had already effectively lost the war, carried within its hull a cargo that pointed toward the next chapter of human history, the atomic age. The purges, connections between Hitler's military technology, the Cold War arms race, and the nuclear era are not coincidental. They are the direct legacy of the most technologically advanced military buildup that any nation had ever attempted, directed by a man whose ideology made no room for the kind of pragmatic international cooperation that might have channeled that technology toward human benefit rather than human annihilation. Today, the preserved U-boats stand as memorials to this complex legacy. Among the best known is U-995, a submarine that surrendered in May 1945 at Trondheim, Norway, later served briefly in the Norwegian Navy before being returned to Germany in 1965, and now rests at Labeau, near Kiel, preserved as a museum ship beside the Marine Ehrenmal Memorial. Visitors who step inside its narrow hull experience the oppressive quarters where 45 men once lived, worked, and fought for weeks at a time. In France, U-123, renamed Blazon, became one of the few to see regular peacetime service. Across the Atlantic, the United States preserved U-505, captured intact in June 1944, which, after serving as an intelligence prize during the war, was eventually transferred to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where it remains today, meticulously restored, the first enemy warship ever displayed on American soil. The public fascination with the U-boats has only grown in the decades since the war. Museums in Hamburg, Kiel, and Labeau draw thousands each year. For veterans and researchers alike, these submarines are more than relics. They are reminders of the human cost beneath the waves. Over 30,000 German submariners and countless Allied sailors never returned. The machines that once symbolized stealth and precision now stand for loss, innovation, and remembrance. Today, the preserved boats and the wrecks below the Atlantic serve as twin memorials, one above water and one below, telling the final story of Germany's submarine fleet, an empire of steel that now rests in silence between history and the sea. Now let us turn to the broader picture of what Hitler's singularity as a dictator means for history's judgment of him, and for the lessons that can be drawn from his rise and fall. We have seen that he was the opposite of other dictators in his origins, a failed artist and former corporal, rather than a trained revolutionary or military professional. We have seen that he was the opposite of other dictators in his path to power, coming through elections and constitutional appointment rather than coup or conquest. We have seen that he was the opposite of other dictators in his relationship with his military, systematically destroying professional independence rather than cultivating it. We have seen that he was the opposite of other dictators in the centrality of ideology to his decision-making, consistently choosing ideological consistency over strategic rationality. We have seen that he was the opposite of other dictators in his treatment of his inner circle, managing through chaos and rivalry rather than through institutional loyalty. We have seen that he was the opposite of other dictators in his willingness to destroy his own country rather than accept defeat. And we have seen that he was the opposite of other dictators in his end, choosing suicide over any possibility of survival. What does all this add up to? It adds up to a figure who is genuinely singular in the history of human tyranny, and whose singularity makes the task of learning from him both more urgent and more difficult. The usual lessons from dictators are roughly the following. Watch out for charismatic military leaders who seize power through force, build strong institutions that can resist individual concentration of power, ensure that the military remains under civilian control, protect free speech and independent media. Be especially vigilant during economic crises when extremist parties can make their greatest gains. These lessons are all valid, but Hitler's case shows that they are not sufficient. Hitler was not a military leader. He was a civilian who seized political power through legal means. He did not obviously destroy democratic institutions. He used democratic institutions against themselves. Germany in 1933 was not a new or fragile democracy. It was a sophisticated modern state with a constitution, a free press, independent courts, and a professional civil service. All of those institutions failed to stop Hitler. And they failed because Hitler was something genuinely new, a politician who understood mass communication technology better than any of his contemporaries, who understood the psychology of humiliation and resentment better than any of his contemporaries, and who offered a coherent, emotionally compelling narrative of national destiny to a people who had been stripped of their national self-confidence by military defeat, economic catastrophe, and international humiliation. This is why Field Marshal Wilhelm List's story is so instructive. After the First World War, List remained in the reduced Reichswehr, helping to modernize Germany's military under the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. With the outbreak of World War II, he played a key role in the German invasion of Poland in 1939. His success in this operation earned him Hitler's favor, and by 1940 he was promoted to Field Marshal. One of List's most notable assignments was leading German forces during the Balkan Campaign of 1941. He commanded Army Group A in the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. However, List's involvement in the Balkans also connects him to the darker aspects of the war. The region saw brutal repression, mass executions, and harsh reprisals against partisans and civilians. In 1942, List's career ended abruptly during Case Blue, the German summer offensive on the Eastern Front. Tasked with capturing the vital oil fields in the Caucasus, his forces faced logistical challenges and strong Soviet resistance. When the operation faltered, Hitler dismissed List from command. He was later arrested by Allied forces and tried in the hostages trial, where German generals were prosecuted for war crimes in the Balkans. List was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1948, but was released in 1953 due to ill health. He continued to live for 19 more years, passing away on August 17, 1971, at the age of 91. List's trajectory mirrors that of many German commanders: professional excellence in the service of an ideological war that they had enabled, partial accountability at Nuremberg, premature release, and a quiet, largely unexamined old age. The lesson of his life, and the lives of all the generals who served Hitler, is that professional military competence is no guarantee of moral clarity, and that the willingness to serve an ideology without questioning it leads not to military success, but to complicity in atrocity. Albert Kesselring, Field Marshal and one of World War II's most diverse career commanders, whose pleasant demeanour won him the affectionate nickname Smiling Albert among those who held him in high regard, provides another dimension of this lesson. Kesselring's military career started in World War I and continued into the Weimar Republic before he shifted to the Luftwaffe in 1935. His role in World War II was significant, leading air fleets in Poland and France, playing a crucial part in the Battle of Britain and following the Allied invasions of Sicily and Italy in 1943, devising a defensive strategy that delayed Allied victory for over a year. He remained loyal to Hitler throughout his career. In October 1947, a British military court in Venice found him guilty of war crimes, specifically for ordering the execution of 335 Italian civilian hostages in the Ardeatine Cave massacre of March 1944, carried out as retaliation for an Italian partisan attack on German soldiers. Initially sentenced to death on May 6, 1947, his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. He was pardoned and released in 1952 because of his declining health, after which he became involved in numerous veterans' associations. He passed away in 1960. The Ardeatine Cave massacre, in which 335 men and boys were shot in a cave complex outside Rome in a single afternoon, stands as a monument to what the ideology of collective punishment, when filtered through the command structures of a military serving an ideological dictator, produces. The victims were not partisans. They were hostages, rounded up from Roman jails, many of them Jews, killed to satisfy a ratio of reprisals that Hitler's system had imposed on all occupied territories. 10 civilian lives for every German soldier killed. No other military in the Second World War operated on such a formalized system of mass collective punishment. It was the application in the occupied territories of the same logic that drove the Holocaust, that non-Aryan lives were expendable instruments in the service of German ideological objectives. Erich von Manstein, widely considered by military historians to be one of the most talented operational commanders of the entire Second World War, illustrates perhaps the most poignant dimension of what it meant to serve Hitler. Manstein started World War II as the Chief of Staff to General Gerd von Rundstedt during the invasion of Poland in 1939. He came up with the bold plan to invade France through the Ardennes forest, a strategy initially ignored by the German High Command, but later embraced enthusiastically by Hitler himself. After commanding infantry during the French campaign and becoming a general in June 1940, Manstein led the 56th Panzer Corps in the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, almost capturing Leningrad before being transferred south. After taking command of the 11th Army, he captured Sevastopol in July 1942, resulting in his promotion to Field Marshal, and his performance in the desperate winter battles of 1942 and 1943, including the recapture of Kharkov in February 1943, is still studied in military academies around the world as an example of operational brilliance under the most extreme pressure. But despite all this, he was dismissed by Hitler in March 1944 because Hitler could not tolerate the kind of honest professional military counsel that Manstein consistently offered. Manstein told Hitler repeatedly that the strategic situation required elastic defense rather than rigid positional warfare, that the Wehrmacht needed to be allowed to trade space for time, and that unless it was, the Soviets would destroy it division by division in frontal assaults that Germany could not sustain. Hitler dismissed these assessments as defeatism. He dismissed Manstein, and the catastrophe that Manstein had predicted followed with almost mathematical precision. After the war, Manstein was captured by the British and stood trial for war crimes. While he was acquitted of the most serious charges, he remained imprisoned until his release due to health issues in 1953. He later served as an advisor to the West German government on army organization. His memoirs, titled Verloren Siege, Lost Victories, were published and remain one of the most important primary sources on the German military experience of the Second World War. He passed away in 1973. The title of his memoirs tells the whole story. Victories that were lost not because the German army lacked talent or courage, but because its supreme commander was constitutionally incapable of listening to the men who had won those victories. Alfred Jodl, holding the rank of General Oberst and serving as the Chief of Operations Staff within the High Command of the German Armed Forces throughout the duration of the war, represents the other side of the same coin. He was apprehended by British soldiers on May 23, 1945, alongside the rest of Admiral Dönitz's Flensburg government. He was initially confined in Camp Ashcan before being presented to the International Military Tribunal at the Nuremberg trials. He stood accused of scheming to perpetrate crimes against peace, initiating and conducting wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The primary accusations tied to his name were his endorsement of the Commando Order and the Commissar Order, which mandated the immediate execution of specific categories of prisoners of war upon capture. Jodl justified the 1941 mass shootings of Soviet prisoners of war by asserting that only those prisoners who chose not to walk were executed, not those physically unable to do so, a distinction that even the Nuremberg judges found morally repugnant. Jodl pleaded not guilty, but was eventually found guilty on all 4 counts, and subsequently hanged in Nuremberg prison on October 16, 1946. His final utterance was, "Ich grüße dich, mein ewiges Deutschland," or "I salute you, my eternal Germany." This final statement tells you everything about the tragedy of the professional German military class under Hitler. Even at the moment of execution, Jodl was not saluting the Nazi ideology that had brought him to the gallows. He was saluting Germany itself, the idea of Germany, the professional soldier's Germany of discipline and service that he believed he had served. But that Germany and Hitler's Germany had been indistinguishable during the 12 years of Nazi rule, and the price of that indistinguishability was paid on the gallows at Nuremberg. Wilhelm Keitel, one of Adolf Hitler's closest and most loyal associates, provides the starkest example of the contrast between professional military identity and ideological complicity. Keitel served as the chief of Hitler's personal military staff throughout the war. Tried at Nuremberg alongside other top Nazi officials, his war planning activities were presented as evidence of crimes against peace, and the orders he issued during the Russian offensive were characterized as war crimes against civilians. Unlike most defendants, Keitel accepted responsibility for his actions, acknowledging that he was responsible for all outcomes resulting from his signed orders. In October 1946, he was found guilty of the charges and sentenced to death. Despite his request for execution by a military firing squad, Keitel was hanged on October 16, 1946, in Nuremberg. His final words have been recorded as expressing regret for the trust he had placed in Hitler, an acknowledgement that he had served a master who had used that trust to commit crimes against humanity. Keitel's acceptance of responsibility, unique among the major defendants in its directness, represents the closest thing to a reckoning that the German military command ever offered the world. It was insufficient given the scale of what had been done, but it was honest, and honesty at the Nuremberg gallows was not easy or common. The contrast between how Hitler's regime ended and how other authoritarian regimes have ended tells us something important about the nature of his system and why it was genuinely unprecedented. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, reunified Germany started to confront its wartime past more openly. Newly opened archives and survivor testimonies revealed how Waffen-SS units operated alongside the security police and Einsatzgruppen, disproving the long-standing myth of a clean, purely military force. Yet even as scholarship dismantled these illusions, political and social controversies emerged. In the 1990s, journalists discovered that some former Waffen-SS members were still receiving state pensions under the old Federal War Victims Relief Act. Reports in Der Spiegel and the New York Times sparked outrage, especially when it became clear that many Holocaust survivors had never received comparable compensation. Beyond Germany's borders, the Waffen-SS legacy took on new and troubling forms. In parts of Eastern Europe, especially the Baltic states and Ukraine, veterans of locally recruited SS divisions began to be commemorated as national fighters against Soviet occupation. Annual marches in Riga, honouring the 15th and 19th Latvian SS divisions, drew sharp criticism from Jewish organisations and the European Parliament. These events underscored how the image of the Waffen-SS had become entangled with post-Soviet identity politics. Inside Germany, attitudes shifted again. By the 2000s, open admiration for the Waffen-SS was taboo. Displaying SS symbols was banned under Section 86A of the Criminal Code, yet far-right groups online continued to use SS imagery, portraying the Waffen-SS as models of strength or European brotherhood. German authorities have cracked down repeatedly, calling it a threat to democracy. Today, few Waffen-SS veterans remain. Their associations have vanished, but their legacy endures in the debates, books and myths that still surround them. 80 years later, their story remains a warning about how easily history can be reshaped and how long its echoes can last. No comparable contested memory battle has ever been fought over the legacy of Stalin's NKVD, or Mao's Red Guards, or Saddam's Republican Guards. There are no pension controversies about former officials of those regimes, because those regimes, however terrible, did not construct an ideology so powerful that its adherents continued defending it for 7 decades after its military defeat. This is the final and most haunting way in which Hitler was the opposite of every other dictator. His ideology did not die with him. Every other major dictator of the 20th century ruled through a combination of terror, institutional loyalty, and personal patronage. When the terror ended and the institutions collapsed, most of those systems lost their power to command loyalty. Stalin's Soviet Union survived his death because it had genuine institutional structures. A party, a state, a military, an economy that could continue operating without him. When Mikhail Gorbachev began dismantling those structures in the late 1980s, the Soviet Union collapsed because the system had never developed the legitimacy to maintain itself without coercion. But it had survived Stalin because it was more than Stalin. Hitler's Germany, as we have seen, was nothing but Hitler. But the ideology that Hitler championed, the racial anti-Semitism, the conspiracy theories about Jewish global control, the belief in Aryan racial superiority, the conviction that Germany had been betrayed from within, these did not die in the bunker on April 30th, 1945. They went underground. They reappeared in the far-right movements of the 1950s and 1960s. They reappeared in neo-Nazi organizations across Europe and North America. They reappeared in the coded language of white nationalist movements that claim, even today, to have no connection to Nazism while trafficking in its central ideas. They reappear in the 21st century in internet forums and social media platforms where young men encounter, for the first time, the same arguments that were made in Munich beer halls a century ago. Why does this ideology persist when the ideology of every other comparable 20th century dictatorship has largely been discredited and abandoned? Because Hitler's ideology, unlike Stalin's or Mao's, was not primarily about class struggle or state modernization or national liberation. It was about identity. It told its adherents that they were racially superior, that their misfortunes were the result of conspiracy by inferior races, and that they deserved to dominate. These are powerful psychological propositions that tap into deep human needs for belonging, pride, and the attribution of suffering to external enemies. Other ideologies have exploited similar psychological needs, but Hitler exploited them with a targeting precision, aimed at the specific humiliations and anxieties of a specific people at a specific historical moment, that created an ideology whose core propositions are still capable of activating those same psychological responses in people who share nothing else with 1930s Germany. This is the most important reason why Hitler is unlike every other dictator in history. Other dictators ruled through terror and institutional control. Their systems ended when those mechanisms failed. Hitler's system was sustained at its core by a psychological offering, the promise of racial superiority and historical destiny. That offering did not require institutional maintenance. It could survive underground. It could survive defeat. It could survive the Nuremberg trials and Operation Deadlight and the denazification courts and the Federal War Victims Relief Act and the dissolution of Hayag in 1992. It could survive all of these things because it was not ultimately about politics or institutions. It was about the deepest and most manipulable aspects of human psychology. The need to belong, the need to matter, the need to believe that suffering is not random but caused, and that it can be avenged. How do we counter something like that? The answer is not simple, and it cannot be reduced to any single policy recommendation. But understanding precisely what Hitler was, understanding his uniqueness among dictators, his genuine novelty as a historical phenomenon, is the essential first step. Treat him as merely another authoritarian ruler, as merely another Stalin or Mussolini scaled up in violence, and you miss what was genuinely new and genuinely dangerous about him. He was a mass media demagogue who understood democratic psychology well enough to use democracy against itself. He was an ideological fanatic who put racial mythology above strategic rationality and was willing to sacrifice everything, Germany itself, in service of that mythology. He was a court politician who maintained power through chaos and personal manipulation rather than through institutional structures. He was the only major dictator of the modern era who was genuinely willing to die in a defeated capital rather than attempt survival. And he was the prophet of an ideology that, uniquely among the ideologies that powered 20th century dictatorships, has shown the capacity to persist and revive across generations and continents, because it targets not political allegiances but personal identities, not institutional loyalties but the deepest psychological needs. To understand Adolf Hitler is not to sympathize with him, nor to minimize the horror of what he built and ordered. It is to understand that the dangers he represents are not in the past. They are in the human capacity for self-deception and the human vulnerability to manipulation through identity and fear. That capacity and that vulnerability are with us still. They will be with us as long as there are humans to possess them. The field marshals who served Hitler, men like Brauchitsch and Loeb and Kleist and List and Keitel and Jodl, did not serve him because they were incapable of moral reasoning. Many of them were sophisticated, educated, professionally accomplished individuals with distinguished careers and, in some cases, genuine personal decency in private life. They served him because he had constructed a system in which not serving him was unthinkable, and in which the incremental steps from compliance to complicity to atrocity were so small that no single step seemed to cross a clear moral threshold. This is the most dangerous lesson of Hitler's reign, and the lesson that is hardest to apply to one's own situation. That evil on the scale that Hitler achieved is almost never the product of monsters. It is the product of ordinary people making incremental choices within a system that normalizes those choices, that provides rewards for compliance and punishments for resistance, and that wraps the whole structure in an ideology powerful enough to preempt the moral reasoning that might otherwise halt the process. The wives who opened boarding houses and wrote memoirs defending their SS-serving husbands were not monsters. The children who spent their lives defending fathers who ran the Holocaust or served as governors of occupied territories where millions were murdered were not monsters. The generals who fired and demoted and eventually tried at Nuremberg were, many of them, professional soldiers of the same type that armies have always recruited. What was monstrous was the system in which they all operated, the system that one man had built, the man who was, in every important way, the opposite of every other dictator in history, Adolf Hitler. The story does not end in 1945. It continues in the post-war struggles of families to reconcile with impossible inheritances. It continues in the underground bunkers below Berlin, where archaeologists still occasionally find artifacts. It continues in the cold Atlantic, where over 100 U-boat hulls rest on the seabed, memorials to 30,000 young men who were sent to die in service of an ideology they had not chosen and could not question. It continues in the archives of Nuremberg, where the transcripts of the trials of men like Jodl and Keitel and Kleist are still studied by historians trying to understand how professional military service and mass murder can coexist in the same human biography. It continues in the ongoing debates in Germany and across Europe about how to commemorate, contextualize, and teach a past that is not safely past. It continues in the conversations between parents and children about what their grandparents or great-grandparents did or did not do between 1933 and 1945. It continues, most importantly, in the recognition that the conditions that produced Hitler, economic catastrophe, national humiliation, the failure of established institutions to address genuine grievances, the availability of powerful new communication technologies in the hands of demagogues, and the ancient human susceptibility to simple explanations for complex suffering are not historical relics. They are present conditions. They are the conditions of our world today, in many countries, on many continents. Understanding why Adolf Hitler was the opposite of every other dictator in history is not an academic exercise. It is a survival skill. And it is one that no generation in the 8 decades since his death has been able to afford to forget. Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you found this video both informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed diving deep into this extraordinary and sobering chapter of history, make sure to check out our other videos on the German generals who served and survived the Third Reich, the families who lived in its shadow, and the Waffen-SS soldiers who were left to reckon with its legacy. There is always more to discover about the most consequential conflict in human history, and we are here to help you discover it. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one!